Some things to keep in mind as we're looking at how we use Agile at OpenUp and in the civic tech space. The reason we use Agile and lean principles in the civic tech space for more than just the tiny part of a project that is the technology is because we believe it can contribute the risk management and fast learning seen in the innovative tech world and can bring that to the space. Agile training is normally workshops and practicals and supported in practice with a trained Scrum Master since the learning continues on the job. Just slides and a video like this is not considered a sufficient way of training people in Agile. This is just a stopgap. The team needs to look at reference material, study for themselves, and support each other in learning this. When trying to apply Agile principles and methods, it's important to understand the intent behind each principle and activity, especially if you want to adapt them to fit the context better. And that intent isn't always immediately clear, so read around the subject before changing things or thinking something is totally stupid. Learn to be okay with the fact that something won't be implemented or done perfectly the first time. That's actually the entire point of Agile. Humans don't communicate perfectly. We don't understand the problem perfectly. Instead of not doing anything until we think we can communicate properly or understand the problem perfectly, an iteration is just doing the best we can with what we have and seeing if we got to where we want to be when we're done with that iteration. At that point, it's much clearer what the next step should be. The same principle goes for implementing this process that is Agile. As we just have to start doing stuff and see if we did it well and see if we want to improve on it. If something was so off track that actually deploying it at the end of the sprint would do more harm than good, it's okay not to release that. But if a change is a general improvement, albeit not perfect, you should always lean towards releasing it instead of having that work in progress sit around with the learnings and end user value not getting out to the world.
Okay, so yeah, like I was saying, a while back we did an introduction to Scrum and Agile, and I think that was helpful. We had a bigger sort of engineering team in quotes. One bit of context to that is that I think we had slightly bigger teams and slightly more people, and but it was useful to just have the same reference framework for how we organize projects, because a lot of the project organization was coming from the tech people at that stage. I think there's a lot of this needs to be taken with a pinch of salt, and because we are somewhat differently configured from a typical software company where a lot of these things come from. And so, like I did before, I want to go through these things quite quickly. I think do stop and ask if I've completely lost you. But we'll dig into like more nuanced discussion, I think, afterwards. So I'm going to try and spend about half an hour on just introducing a whole bunch of these concepts, and it'll be a bit of an information overload. And then we can sort of touch on, you please ask questions and we can clarify things and relate things back to how we work at OpenUp, and then refer to specific slides that can help unpack that a little bit more. So before we jump into those things, I've realized one nice way to start thinking about this is, so it is Civic Tech. This set of slides was for a Civic Tech conference. So what happens, one thing I want to start with is what happens when technology is done well, and especially civic technology is done well. Can you see my slide for that says domain research?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So someone should be understanding the domain and understanding, like, in quite a lot of detail what we're talking about. We're not necessarily building apps all the time. Sometimes we make a little booklet. Someone needs to understand the content and the space we're working in, whatever we're doing. So what I want to go through first is just a list of like the different concerns that need to be paid attention to if we're going to do our projects well. And if I miss something, I'd like you guys to pitch in and suggest some things that I've missed. So yeah, so someone needs to be paying attention to the domain and research that and understand what we're talking about. Someone needs to do some user research and understand who we're trying to do something for. So someone needs to understand the users that this is intended for, and understand what works for them, what their needs are, and meet them where they are, or help the project to meet them where they are. Someone needs to understand the medium that you're trying to use to reach those users. So this is a screenshot from a government website that's been online for many, many years, and there's an incredible depth and breadth of fantastic data there that's been published regularly, and no one can find it, because if you search for the content on that site, you get one search result. That site isn't indexed properly by Google, so no one can find this stuff. If you're making videos, someone needs to understand how do you convey information with videos. Otherwise, you're probably going to miss an opportunity. Someone needs to be able to do visual design and make things look pretty and usable. And then someone needs to track requirements. There's all these nuanced conversations going on around a project, talking about the users, talking about and their needs, talking about the domain and what are the key things to pull out there. And that's actually quite a complex task. And there's a lot of tooling around to help manage that, but you definitely need someone who is responsible for just keeping track of those things. And the moment there's a requirement that is deemed worth investing in, someone needs to be responsible for ensuring that that's going to be tracked and not going to be dropped. You can't just rely on it just happening. You do need the team to buy into using whatever tooling and system you're using for that, but I think it's very important for someone to own always capturing that, so that you don't just think, oh, someone else has already captured it, I'm not going to capture it. Then someone needs to make it show up online. Otherwise, you might think it's done, but it's not actually reachable yet. This is if you're doing something that's online. Someone needs to get it out there. And then if you're building some new technology, someone has to actually go and build it. And that's where software developers come in. If you're building a website or an online tool, someone needs to own it actually remaining up and online, and be responsible for making sure that it's maintainable enough for that project. Some projects don't need to be very maintainable. They're really only needed for a short while, and there isn't a lot of money for it. So it's fine that it's not very maintainable, but a lot of things you do want to be maintainable because you do want them to be around for a long time. You might need your data to be backed up or to be secure against people modifying it or hacking it. And so this is showing just some tracking we've got set up that emails me when sites go down, so that we know about it, rather than we only find out when someone says, hey, I tried to use this site, but it was down. And then someone needs to be responsible for bringing it all together. There's a lot of information and decisions, and you can't just assume that it's going to happen. Someone has to ultimately have the responsibility of ensuring that all of these people that can pay attention to these different concerns are actually involved, and keep it cohesive, because information can change, your knowledge changes, you keep adding features, things can drift. And this may not be individuals, one person dealing with each concern, and it may not be experts. We're a very tiny organization. But it's really important for people to know what needs to be considered when you're trying to do things in a professional manner, and so that if you're not going to have an expert dealing with requirements gathering, at least know that someone should be paying attention to that as well as they could. So I think that's a good place to leave this one. Are there any other concerns that or you think need to be mentioned, touched on in projects that I haven't mentioned yet?
I don't know if this is too early for this. My question is, what happens when you're working on small projects that don't have, is it that every project, this is a requirement for every single project and that it must be done like as a sort of staple of the organization, and projects can't proceed unless it's done? What happens if a project has like a really small overheads, and we have to limit the number of people actually working on that project? And we can't assign someone to be like, to manage the Trello board, like manage a vast Trello board with like everyone's inputs and stuff. Like, what size of project is this most efficient at? And is there a way that it can scale to small projects?
I think that's a really important question. I think the quick answer is, to the degree that everyone agrees makes sense for that project. I think for a lot of these things, they are all things that the project needs to some degree. But we at OpenUp seem to be making the choice frequently to have people wearing multiple hats, for better or worse. I think for better, because otherwise so many of our projects are too small to have people wear fewer hats. So yeah, I think let's come back to the question at the end, because I think that's really fundamentally underpinning this whole thing. To be honest, let's touch on what often goes wrong. Even assuming everyone cares about the project and is intent on it succeeding, you might build something and it doesn't solve the right problem. You might build something that's already existed because you didn't research what else is there already. You might build something and it's not used. You might build something and it's not what you wanted it to be. You start building something and it's way bigger, more complex and expensive than you planned, or you start building something and just doesn't get done. So a lot of what we want to touch on here is to try and address a lot of these things. And of course, I think we've all seen horror stories of other things that go wrong. I think these are some of the core things that we're trying to address with this. So what I'm going to be talking about here is Agile and Lean and user-centered design. And a lot of this, from my perspective, comes from the software development industry. But they've drawn it from other industries. So these are, I'm going to try and distinguish a little bit between principles and then look at some methods that we've used, and we need to be adapting those methods and to our context and to our scale, like Matt's mentioned. So Agile is fundamentally a manifesto and a set of principles, and it's intended to be minimizing risk. It comes from observing what was done when things went well and when it didn't. And it tries to address human nature in the face of complexity. They say we want to favor individuals and interactions over processes and tools. We want to favor working software, or in our context, we can say a working intervention over comprehensive documentation. It's more important to have that intervention out there than to have documented precisely. And you might swap this for whatever you want. Yeah, I don't want to go too deep down that rabbit hole, but a working something over comprehensive documentation of how to operate that something. You want to favor stakeholder collaboration over contract negotiation, and you want to favor responding to change over following a plan. So yeah, this is the screenshot, and this is us practicing Agile by going out to, I think this was Northwest, and meeting with potential users and people who are interested in what we were building. to get what we were building in front of them and to try and have some of that exchange happening. Agile is not changing direction whenever we want, and guaranteeing that our plans will be met. Agile is not a methodology, and it's not a textbook. But I think an important one is Agile doesn't mean we change direction whenever we want. That's a common misconception. So the Agile Principles are, and there's a bunch of these, you want to satisfy the beneficiary early and continuously. You want to welcome changing requirements, and this is not a contradiction on what I just said. Even late in development, you want to welcome changing requirements. Domain experts and developers should be working together throughout the day, and you want a project of motivated individuals, and you want to be supporting them and trusting them to get the job done. Face-to-face is the most efficient, and we need to figure out what that means when we're working remotely with each other and also with clients and users. You want to have some measure of success, and in the software world, they say by working software, but that could be by some intervention, by booklets that are actually distributed and not just lying in a box. And you want sustainable development, which means you need to maintain your pace indefinitely, and you need to adapt your processes so that you can maintain your pace indefinitely. You do want to favor technical excellence, whatever that means for your project. So not just pile up a bunch of hacks and things and make it really hard to keep maneuvering. So it's worth investing in good practices. That's why I do spend some time and a need to look at how we're doing stuff. And you maximize the amount of work not done. What that means is, instead of celebrating having done a whole bunch of work, it's rather to think, what can we skip right now? What can we defer and do later, and perhaps never? And self-organizing teams lead to the best solutions. Giving teams everything that they need to just take care of the problem, and then let them take care of the problem, rather than management from on high saying, do this, now do this, and you are going to do this role, and you're going to do this role. Let the team figure out together. And that's kind of hard for us when we're a team of 1 to 3 people, depending on which day you're checking. But that's something we need to figure out. And then you need to reflect regularly and improve how the team works. And we use retrospectives for that. But broadly, this is a common principle in Agile. So Agile methodologies are different from Agile. Sometimes they look a bit silly, and they might look like games, and you'll see later why I mentioned that. It's not a textbook. There's not a correct way that you can just go and implement. And incremental change is built in to address that. You need to try something and then increment towards an implementation of these Agile principles that works for your project. And then you need to look at the intent. So when we're looking at Scrum now as one Agile methodology, we need to be looking at the intent behind that, that particular element or something. And I think what's it trying to achieve, and how does it apply to us, so we can get the benefits of that in our context. So for one example of from Kanban, which is another methodology, is to limit the number of tasks in progress. And Kanban, it says there's a hard limit. And what that means is work in progress is worthless. It's not out there benefiting beneficiaries. So the less you have in progress, the better. Because if you can actually pull up people together and get one thing out faster, then there's more value out there supporting your users. So now I'm going to jump into Scrum. Any questions quickly right now before I jump into Scrum?
I don't know if it's too early. I don't know. I'm curious. How do you balance that simplicity and that whole idea of getting favoring something that's built over favoring something that's documented correctly? Because in my mind, that if you don't document something correctly, it actually hampers you down the line, especially if you have to take a break from a project. You know, where's that? I mean, yeah, that balance to me seems a little bit like it doesn't gel.
I think that's a really good question. Sorry to cut you short, but especially what you mentioned on if you need to come back to a project. And a lot of what we do, I think, is do a little bit on a project and then come back to the project later. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it for our context specifically. This also touches on when you mention documenting something on investing in excellence, technical excellence, and that's supporting that notion that you need to be working sustainably. You want to be able to carry on a project in the long term. So I've done Agile Manifesto. So traditionally, you'd have waterfall projects. You have maybe a month to specify, and then you take a few weeks to design, and then you take a few weeks to code and build stuff. Then you give what you've built to a group of people called quality assurance, and they test stuff, and then you ship it because now you're done. And when you ship it, you realize that it doesn't at all satisfy anyone's needs. And this, we just distinguish between, we compare it to waterfall, because that's where a lot of people come from when you do need to give agile training. But I think everyone is pretty aware of how we work, that it's not waterfall. But it's good to know what else is there, and that's not necessarily wrong. And Adrian can tell you that they've had very effective projects in government where they have very fixed milestones, and that works for certain contexts. But especially for very experimental work where you really don't understand what's going to go wrong, these things are helpful, and I think you'll see why quite soon. So fundamental principles of Agile software development is that it's team-based, whatever team means for us. And that's something that I've battled with a bit. And I think we need to sort of actively define for ourselves. It's incremental, it's iterative, it's value-driven. And I think, I've touched on a lot of these things. I'll now point out a few of the different pieces of Scrum. Now, like I mentioned, Scrum is a methodology. I've linked to the Scrum guide. Scrum is typically well suited to a team of 5 to 9 people. And there are a few different roles. Now, I said the team is self-organizing, but the part of the team that is generally implementing stuff is called contributors. And they are self-organizing. They have all the skills to complete whatever is needed, whatever is expected from the team. And then there's a couple of other roles that sort of help make the entire Scrum process work. The reason we're looking at Scrum is that it's a really well-established methodology. There's a Scrum user group in Cape Town. It works really well for that kind of context. And I find that a lot of the tools and methods and practices in Scrum are still very applicable to us, but we do need to consciously and actively adapt them to us. So one of the main pieces of Scrum is the product backlog, and we all use Trello boards and sometimes Pivotal for things like this. And from that backlog, you you do sprint planning, and select an amount of work to do. Then you have a sprint where you're working on that slice of the work. You also have a daily Scrum or a daily stand-up in a team, where you say, what did you do yesterday? What will you do today? And do you have any impediments? Is there anything stopping you from achieving what you're supposed to be working on? And this is supposed to force us basically to exchange and not just keep our struggles to ourselves, but to maybe someone has already solved this problem, or they know how you could quickly solve that problem. And at the end of a sprint, you would have a sprint review to see what you've achieved compared to what you haven't achieved, and a sprint retrospective to look at how's this process working for us? Can we change it a little bit? And this comes up all the time. It's so fundamental that the first thing I say about Scrum is if you still doing textbook Scrum, even in a team of 5 to 9 people, if you're doing textbook Scrum 3 sprints in, you're probably doing Scrum wrong because you should be adapting it. But after the end of your sprint, you have a potentially shippable product, or you're shipping all the time, but you can now see how you've moved forward over one sprint. And you need to have delivered something. It's very important to be always delivering something. Even if it isn't what you hoped it would be, you've delivered something and you've moved forward. So sprint timeline, I think I don't need to go into detail. Basically, you have sprint planning, develop, and then you have a sprint review and a retrospective. Now, a traditional Scrum team has a product owner, and you'll find me lamenting the lack of product owners and begging for product owners a lot, because I think this is important. And their job is basically to look at, we're on 14 out of 33. They should be looking at all the possible features that could be relevant to this, and filtering it down to, these are the features that are highest priority for us to be working on next. There's an infinite number of things you can be doing, and it's easy to panic and think your backlog is just growing of all the things that you could be doing. The product owner's job is to go, this is the next feature. So the title of the slide is the Scrum Team, and it shows different roles in the Scrum Team. Sean. The delivery team is working on those feature requests. The Scrum Master, here it's shown with a little oil can on the cogs. The Scrum Master is not normally supposed to be part of the team, and this is something I think it's difficult for us when we have so few people. There's no way we could ever have a dedicated Scrum Master. Traditionally, the Scrum Master is there to help make sure that the product owner who's saying, give me this feature, and the delivery team is saying, we can only do so much, are communicating effectively and implementing this process. Because it's really just a way of communicating, empowering the team to do what they're good at, and giving the team and the product owner who's pulling features from the team language to communicate about what they need. So this is the Scrum Framework. You've got the backlog. At the very high level, you do sprint planning. So you have a sprint backlog. You work for the period of the sprint at OpenUp, which is usually 2 weeks. You have daily stand-ups during that sprint to see where you are. At the end of the sprint, you do a sprint review and a sprint retrospective, and then you iterate on that. You do sprint planning again, where you look at the backlog and you see what part of that backlog you're going to work on this sprint. Then this is the Scrum team. So the product owner filters down the entirety of the backlog to a selection of features that should be worked on next. The delivery team is implementing on that, and the Scrum Master is greasing those wheels, ensuring that the communication is working correctly and that the methodology is being implemented, and the methodology is just there to give a shared language. And the kinds of things that this is addressing is that sometimes people say they want to be working on something else, and the product owner says, well, I get to say what we're working on next, not you. And that's for the best of the product. Everyone needs to accept that. This is a kind of a social contract. The product owner says what we're going to be working on next. If someone in the delivery team thinks something else is more important, that's nice. They can lobby the product owner and say, for the user, this is really important. Ultimately, it's the product owner's decision. They might be wrong, but it's really important that there's just one person who decides what we're going to be working on next. Otherwise, everyone is pulling in different directions. At the same time, the product owner might go, hey guys, I really think you should be doing more. And this methodology is there to help the team say, you know what, I would like to be able to do more, but this is the reality of what we're doing. This thing just takes so long. And I think people find that communication quite hard, perhaps more in bigger places, but it can still be intimidating and awkward in small places. So the methodology is there to be a shared language and understand what their roles are. No one says that the product owner has the perfect, correct vision of what needs to be done, but if you have a single flawed vision rather than many flawed visions, at least you're pulling in the same direction, and you should be learning based on that through your iterations and your review. So the product owner should be setting the vision, and that's saying, like, in a medium term, in a long term, where are we headed for? And then managing the backlog towards that vision to say, to get there, in the first iteration, we can do this thing. And then in the next 5 iterations, if we're doing these other things, we're moving towards that vision. But having that vision there and clear to everyone, it helps to know, like, this is what we're going for. Even if in the first 5 iterations, it's not going to be that thing yet. They're also responsible for elaborating on the features. They're the central point who needs to be understanding what they're building. They need to do a ton of research. Even if they're not necessarily speaking to users themselves, they need to speak to someone who's speaking to users. Even if they're not the domain expert themselves, they need to be speaking to someone who really deeply understands the domain. And then, but they don't necessarily get to decide when something gets done. They get to say, this is what I'd like. The team can say, this is what's possible, right? But the product owner is responsible for owning, given what's possible, this is what's going to happen next. And then they review what's been implemented and decides whether that is actually what was asked for or not, and actually satisfies that. And that's about understanding, are we done with this feature? Can we move on to a next feature?
JD,
yeah.
Can the Scrum Master be the product owner?
So the Scrum Master, I think, should ideally not have skin in the game, because that allows them to, that brings a lot of trust, because the product owner also often needs help to better implement the thing. And if people don't really trust them, if they feel like the product owner is being biased towards, like, getting more features done, then they're not going to, So it's obviously, we're tiny. It's really hard for us to have completely independent Scrum Masters, and an Agile coach serves a very similar role to a product owner, to a Scrum Master. So Agile coach, Scrum Master, very similar thing for various methodologies. You really want the product owner to be separate. You also want the product owner to be separate from the someone in the implementing team, because there's supposed to be this tension. The product owner is asking for work to get done. The team is implementing that work. At the same time, the team gives a bit of back pressure and says, only this much can get done. And the product owner can pull harder, can say, well, I really want more done. And the team goes, well, we've only got these resources. If we reduce scope on some of these things that you're asking to get done, then we can do more things, or we can do fewer things and go deeper. But there's limited resources. So pulling harder doesn't help. And that incentive gets skewed. Like when I was on Villa Kamali, and I would very easily promise to do a lot more because I really want to please people. And I was kind of performing part of the product owner function, but also on the implementing team. And it gets quite messy. So the ideal, I think, is if the product owner is not part of the implementing team.
Can I assume that the project manager is playing that Scrum Master role, or is that an incorrect assumption?
I think the way I usually slice it at OpenUp is that we haven't really had anyone who's been really deeply well versed in Agile. So we haven't officially assigned a Scrum Master role. And part of this is also that everyone in the team is empowered to say, I thought we ascribed to this methodology, but it feels like we're not implementing what I understood to be the system. Do I have a misunderstanding, or should we be tending more towards implementing it this way? So everyone is really empowered to say, you're not following the agreed system. Can you come back to the agreed system, please? And next sprint, after our retrospective, we might raise that this approach isn't working for us and we want to change our approach. But you don't really want to be changing your approach mid-sprint. So everyone is empowered to say, you're not following the rules, and let's change the rules if we're all in agreement at the end of the sprint.
How does it work when you've got absentee product owners? Like no one's really the product owner. They are on paper, but they're not really involved.
It's the bane of my life. So I think I've pushed hardest to have project managers at OpenUp, so that developers can stop managing budgets and tracking spending, because it's very distracting from and contracts. It's very distracting from development work. Then my next bugbear is having product owners, and like I said, they don't need to necessarily be the best in the domain, but what they need to know is how to ask the people, like, what concerns they should be paying attention to, that they should be paying attention to how do you use the medium that you've decided to use, how do you choose a medium, how do you what do the users need, and that means it's not something that you just do correctly. It's something that you do need to figure out what does it mean to be a product owner. So traditionally, Jen's been really good at this. Ad's really good at this. He's just like the CEO and really super busy. And also fundamentally, the product owner shouldn't be a committee, which is another way that it could be horrendously done wrong. And to manage that, we try and put in place like a proxy product owner that proxies the stuff to the committee and at least consolidates into a single flawed vision on the OpenUp side, and then communicates to the committee and then brings it back. But if you don't have a product owner, you don't have a single flawed vision, and you're gonna be pulling in different directions and confused about your vision and your direction. And all I can say is we absolutely need to figure out who the product owner is, and if they're not present, if they're not able to meet frequently with the team. And I think the team needs to be available to the team so that the team can very frequently ask for clarification, because and say, hey, during the sprint we've tried this, we do want to deliver something at the end of the sprint. We need to figure out what it's going to look like now that we've learned something, because not delivering at the end of the sprint is really demotivating and not in the spirit of what we're trying to do. Because if we're not delivering anything, we're not going to learn anything. No one's going to benefit from the work we've done for a week or two. So they really need to be available and help come down to something that can be delivered, given what we now know.
I think there's a lot of one potential problem I've seen with product owners is that, I know you say that they don't necessarily need to be technical, they don't necessarily need to be like domain experts, but I think that you can run into problems in certain cases. Like there could be situations where someone is the domain expert, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best product owner, or they got chosen for that role because it's a job description, or because they thought that they were they are the domain expert. But I don't know how we get out of that, because I think that a lot of the time people attach the tag of product owner, and it seems like a threat to their job. If they aren't the product owner, oh, well, then what are they doing? Type thing. And I think that maybe there's I don't know how we address that, because I mean, obviously it's an important role, but I think that domain expert is just as important as product owner, in a way, and that the person who's the product owner may not be, the person who's the domain expert may not be the right person to be the product owner, but there's like so much tied up from an organizational structure point of view in that person having that role that it can sometimes be detrimental to projects. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's just, I suppose that's just a comment.
I think it's a really, really good point. Yeah, there's a lot to explore here in terms of what does it mean, how this process empowers different people to say different things to each other. Let's go forward and see what else comes out in the time we have available. So traditionally, you have a team of like 7 people plus minus 2 that's focused on implementing. That's not the product owner. That's not the Scrum Master. That's not the project manager. Scrum doesn't mention a project manager. It assumes that someone ensures that we don't go over budget, that we do have a budget, that we do have a contract with the people we're supposed to have contracts with. That's not the stuff that Scrum is concerned with. Scrum defines a product owner, a Scrum Master, and the implementing team. Now, traditionally, that would be a bunch of people. They're cross-functional. They have different skills and experience and contribute different things, and they self-organize and decide who does what when. They are empowered, and not in the sense that they say, actually, I think that's what we need to be doing, and that's what happens. Sense that for sure they say that's what we're doing next, but that's what we should be doing next. But I defer to the product owner to make that call, and at the same time, if the product owner makes the wrong call, that's all on the product owner because they've made that choice. They're empowered in the sense that they decide how they're going to implement those things. If the product owner says, I need a button over there, that's a bad requirement. That's probably not the only way of satisfying the need that they're trying to satisfy. That also really boxes in the team. If the product owner says, I need someone to be able to discover this part of this data set, the team has infinite ways of satisfying that, and they can go and figure out how to do that. That's what they're empowered to do. And the team should be trusted to go and do that and given the space to go and do that. That's when teams are really effective. And it's hard when we're a team of 1 or 2 people. We need to figure out what that means. Particularly if a team is 1 or 2 people, like there's only so many ways you can configure that team and those roles. And it's very hard to have like redundancy in terms of who can do what. And that's something I think we need to be consciously addressing as we're figuring out how we work. To quickly jump to Sean's comment on this methodology being imposed on people, I think that's the last thing we want. I think this should be considered a starting point for a methodology that is entrenched in the way that some of us work and something we can learn from, but not at all the way that things have to be done. So we do need to be thinking, does this work for us? What parts of it does and doesn't work? The reason I suggested we do this, and I'm still going through the classic Scrum slides, is because there's a lot in that. And for me, this is the easy route because I know all of this stuff. So it's easy for me to carry this into how OpenUp works. We need to be teasing out the intent behind a lot of these things and what it achieves and apply that to our context. So the Scrum Master is there to protect the team from the client saying, you're not doing enough. You should be doing more. Why did you do this way? This was wrong. Because that's how a lot of implementers feel. And to provide that safe space and the language and the framework to have this conversation in a way that doesn't actually disadvantage anyone. Just by allocating roles and having this contract of who has what responsibility, and also which comes with baggage, right? And Yeah, so they're there to facilitate, help everyone implement the agreed system, and that agreed system can be modified over time under the agreement of the team, and to teach them to be implementing this properly. So I think project managers can very well be Scrum Masters. If the project manager is also the product owner, things start getting a bit weird. But if you're 3 people, like, you're gonna have to wear multiple hats and be aware of what the risks are there. So artifacts is a word that comes up a lot in Scrum, and it's just useful to have a word for these things. And another misunderstanding of Scrum is that, of Agile, is that you have no process. And it isn't that at all. You're supposed to, you might actually have, and we've seen a treasury client say this at the end of a project once, where they initially thought there was going to be no process, and actually they had better control over things, because looking at this from a high level view, you've got this long-term strategy or vision where you're headed, even if you never reach it. I heard someone call it a North Star recently, that you don't know the path you're going to follow, but you're going towards the North Star. Then at a more detailed level, you're breaking this up into a product backlog that is just a continuous stream of work that's coming. And one long Trello column represents that most of the time. And then you might have a roadmap of different steps or milestones that you want to be meeting at certain points. And we don't work at releases. We tend to deploy something once it's done, but basically think of it as just breaking things up into smaller and smaller units until you get to day to day. Today, I'm going to work on this task. This sprint, we're going to work on this set of tasks or features. And these are artifacts. So we have an artifact, we have records of what we want to be doing that's coming up. We have records of when we committed to do something, when we actually delivered it. We have a space in the Trello card to record why certain decisions were made. There's actually a lot of artifacts and control over what we're doing that. And we have set opportunities to review and modify our process, and also to review and modify our roadmap. So we have very good control, actually, and transparency. And all of this needs to be extremely transparent to external people as well, to clients as well. It can and it should. That's when they're empowered. That's when they are happy, to the degree that they're comfortable. You don't want to drown them in information. Let me take 2 minutes more quickly and just outline planning and touch on a couple of things there. So I've mentioned these different levels of looking at the work. The long-term vision that we might never reach, the roadmap, and that might change over time with agreement with the client and as we're learning things. Then the sprint planning, where we say these are the things that we're making commitments for this sprint, and then the day-to-day, this is the task I'm working on now. In sprint planning, like Dean said, there's a conversation where the product owner says, this is what I want done, and the team goes, well, I think this other thing is actually more urgent, and why? And that's a really nice conversation to have, and a good product owner would be listening to the team, but it's important to know that it's the product owner who then decides, based on some agreement on what can be done. And I can't read the messages quickly enough, but Dean mentioned something about a time box. One thing I want to touch on is that during planning, let's say you have this backlog of stories, and let's say, for argument's sake, the top of the backlog is what you're going to be working on next. These things can be rearranged depending on the information that the product owner has available to make these decisions. So we won't go into like who decides when you refactor something or when you improve something. Let's just say the product owner needs information to decide we're going to be working on this to provide this feature, to fix this bug in this order. And this can be changing all the time, except during a sprint. in a sprint, if you say, I don't know if the next slide, yeah, if you agree as a team that these 3 stories are what you're going to be working on, then that shouldn't be changing. It can change, of course. You can always say, well, COVID just happened. We really need to do this thing now. We need to add a notice to the website. And one of the things where the team is empowered to say is, well, you know what? Adding this notice isn't as easy as you thought. We need to, if we bring this thing in to the sprint that wasn't originally in the sprint. So let's say you committed to the first 3 stories, and now you suddenly bringing in another story, which is adding a notice that links to the COVID information. The team is empowered to say, mid-sprint, you've brought something new in, you have to take something out, because there's only a finite amount of work you can do. Also, how do you decide what you're going to be working on? And generally, that's done on some estimate of how much work you can do. And there's all kinds of science and math and things you can do around that, and it's cool to explore. Let's assume somehow you decide that the team has some confidence that they can achieve these first 3 stories in the sprint, assuming that the resources they have are available, and there aren't any pandemics that come up. That's based on some estimate of how quickly they get work done, and some way of deciding these things. I think something to be aware of is that I really want to bring this in. Estimation is really there. Like, you're going to be wrong, but you do have to make some estimate at some point. But you're going to be wrong. No one can estimate perfectly. It's not there as a way of bashing people over the head. It's there just to get to the point of saying, this is what we're going to be focusing on this sprint. A key thing that distinguishes Scrum from Kanban, for example, which is another methodology, is that you say, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to be working on this stuff. And you, the product owner, does not get to tell us to change direction from these things. If you do, we're going to tell you, A, we're going to deliver even less than we would have, because you're slowing us down because we have to change direction, and we're all focused on this thing right now, and now we have to change focus. So that's going to cost you more than just the cost of that story. But also the team might at some point say, this is harder than I thought. I think something to aim for there is to find the part of that original story that you had planned, and go, is there a simpler version of this that we can get out in this time? And the reason I mentioned estimation or Agile methodologies being games is there's a game called Planning Poker that we use to help us estimate stories in industry, where everyone in the team has a set of cards with a number like 0, half, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 12. And no one is allowed to see the cards of any other person until everyone has put a card down. So let's say you want to estimate a story to decide whether it's too big or can actually fit in the sprint. Then everyone makes their own estimate of that story, and then they put their card down, face down. And then when everyone has put a card down, everyone reveals their cards. And it's really fun when one person said this story is going to be 1 day of work. Like, let's say half a day of the designer and half the day of the dev. In total, that's 1 day, something like that. And that's a thumb suck. That's just a number. It doesn't matter, because what matters is to see if someone else said it's going to take 8 days. Because then you have the conversation. Why do you think it's going to be 8 days? Why does this person think it's going to be 1 day? That's the bit that matters. You want to do that estimation without being influenced by someone else's estimate, to make sure that your understanding of the card is similar enough to someone else's understanding? What's included in this? Is there something that I didn't think of that the other person did think of? Am I overcomplicating it? And someone might also think, well, there's a simpler way we could do this that still achieves the outcome. And that's why user stories, writing what needs to be done, what needs to be achieved in the terms of, as a user, I would like to be able to find this aspect of this data set so that I can apply for my social grant more effectively or something like that. To write user stories that way, rather than, I would like a page that provides this information with a button that takes you to that website, because now you've already said how it needs to be satisfied. And someone might go, there's already a tool, a really good app or something that solves this problem. Why don't we just embed that or add a link to that? And that takes 30 minutes rather than building this whole new thing. So that's what estimation is very much for. And then you need to understand that estimates are going to be wrong. And one of the key principles here is you want to be delivering something every sprint. So let's say your estimate was wrong and you have to go to the product owner with your hat in your hand and say, we committed to this thing. We take our commitments seriously, but we're not going to be able to do all of these things. Let's together find a way to find a slice of this that still delivers value rather than not deliver anything and only delivering something next sprint. Let's get something out this sprint. And at the end of the sprint, we're going to have sprint review. We're going to be able to say we delivered something, but we're cognizant that we reduced scope. Next sprint, what's in the backlog? The product owner might at that point decide, we've actually delivered something on this. I don't think we need to do the rest that we had planned, but that we're not going to do anymore, or that we didn't complete, because what we did deliver is actually sufficient. And this speaks really well to maximizing the work not done. So I think that's a good place to leave this. One of the main things I would like you to get out of this is that there's a lot of tools here and tricks around how to talk in a team and with a client about work that needs to get done. That helps you have those conversations in a way that doesn't feel threatening, or isn't difficult, and improve a process as a team. There is some work involved in adapting it to our context, but there's a lot of tooling here, like planning poker, that we could use. And you don't need to necessarily do that explicitly, but there's a lot of tooling here to work very effectively and to get things out regularly, consistently, sustainably.